A couple of notes. In the spirit of the title of the show today, Inventory, I decided to collect all the old pads of paper we've used over the last year and a half. We start out with 50 pages or so, or 60 pages in a pad, and then do 40, 50 drawings in a show, and then end up with 10 drawings, blank sheets at the end, which go sit on a shelf for a while. So we'll have numerous breaks, for musical breaks in the show today, so that I can switch pads and get rid of all this paper, which I feel guilty about using in the first place, but even more guilty about not using. So if it gets to be too tedious, I'll break out a fresh pad and start the whole noxious pattern all over again. The house I grew up in Chicago had extremely pitched roof, very steep, and ceramic tiles, those sort of circular ceramic tiles, which were very beautiful but very hard to keep from leaking. My family moved there when I was very young. It was a kind of unstable neighborhood. The house had originally been by itself in a large block, and I think it was meant to be entered from the west along this kind of grand drive. Over the course of many years, other houses were built all around it. The neighborhood began to decay, and by the time we got there, there was a fence here, a kind of a wild yard here, an old wooden building which had seen better days across in this sort of empty field, and you entered the house from the side. One night soon after we arrived, this house, the large dilapidated wooden house in the field next to us, caught fire. And apparently we all crawled into bed. My father was away. I looked out at the sort of glow of this building. I recall seeing on the roof of this building a fireman hacking with an axe through the roof to let the flames out. And I'm asking my mother why he was up there doing that. And she said, that's what firemen do. And I was more impressed by the ladder that got him up to the roof than by his heroism. About a year later, all the toilets in the house began to back up. And the experts came out and they diagnosed a root problem and cut all the roots in the yard around the house, and the toilet continued to back up. Then a plumber came with a World War II minesweeper and walked around the entire building. Oh, good. Drum solo. he diagnosed was at some point in the history of this building, after all the other buildings had been put in and the entrance was changed from the west to the south, somebody had just broken the sewer pipe from the house to the street. And the house had been draining into a field, basically turning a city block in Chicago into a leaching field, and had been filling up until it no longer could fill up any longer, I guess. And that was partially because the person who lived there before was a woman named Edith Sampson, who had been one of the first and most corrupt judges, female judges in the Chicago traffic court, as an appointment as reward for long service to the Democratic machine. What Edith Sampson couldn't do in the House by herself, 5 little kids did in 2 years. So we had to put new pipes into the house and reorient the whole building. In the basement of the house was a large circular table, which we still have. Behind it was an alcove with an electric motor and a spit. The story was that every Saturday night, Edith Sampson would roast a pig on the spit, and she and the local precinct captain would split all the money that they had bribed out of people over the course of the week before. I didn't until I started to put the story together. The idea that they would eat an entire pig between the two of them while they split up all of their ill-gotten gains didn't seem incongruous to me. But this enormous engine with the spit made an indelible impression. We turned this space into a theater in the basement, which usually turned into an extended sword fight. The house wasn't exactly haunted, but it was an enormous old cold house. It was empty and frightening for a family of young, imaginative kids, even though it was home. We mostly lived on the second floor. A room for 4 boys, a room for a girl, an empty room, a room for parents. And then the third floor, nobody went into. My father's office was on one side, and then 3 small rooms ran by a balcony. When we go up to the 3rd floor to see my father's office, what we were most impressed by was his enormous desk, a picture of a terrifying-looking man who was a famous jurist behind him, a sculpture of a human figure with the head of a frog and the tail of a dragon doing a cartwheel across the table, and a glass jar with a lid on it, inside a murky yellow liquid holding a human brain. I don't know where my father got the brain, but it somehow symbolized to him his search for knowledge. In one of the little closets by the under the eave of the floor, the roof was so steep at this on the third floor that none of the rooms actually went all the way up. They all were angled. So there was a small half-sized door. We went in there once when my father wasn't there, where he found a box. And inside the box was some oil paper. Inside the oil paper was an enormous green pistol. Which we took downstairs and was immediately confiscated. The pistol was my father's weapon in World War II. He had been issued it as a young soldier, and he had taken it to the firing range and had been so inept shooting at targets that he mailed it to his brother for safekeeping for the balance of the war. And he mailed it back to him at the end of the war, and he put it in a closet and forgot about it. I don't know what happened to it after that. One by one, as the brothers reached a certain age, we were sent upstairs from our communal room to occupy one after another of these empty rooms on the third floor. It didn't seem like an achievement. It felt more like an exile. The rooms were kind of cold and empty. The one thing that was most interesting about being on the third floor, however, was it was close to the attic. The attic was really a trap door in the ceiling outside my room. If you went and got a ladder, it had hooks on the end, and it would hook into eye hooks below the trap door, and you could walk up the ladder. It was too heavy to push with 6-year-old arms, but if you used your head as a battering ram and just kept climbing, you could push enough of the trapdoor open that you could get a purchase on it, and then get it to a kind of tipping point, throw it backwards, and get up into the attic, which really wasn't all that remarkable. It was empty. It had that sort of, this building was old enough that the wood was all rough hewn, and the slats had horsehair and straw and plaster sticking through. And there were 2 upper windows at either end that sort of cast a glow. Didn't spend too much time there. One day when I went up there, I noticed there was a hole in the floor. We went downstairs, discovered in my father's office a hole had suddenly appeared in the ceiling. When we reported this, we were told that this was a mysterious occurrence of no known origin, and the ceiling was fixed. There was an access panel in the roof of the attic that would reach you, or you could reach the outside. And I remember looking outside, pushing it up, looking outside, and being terrified by the steep slope of the ceramic tiles away from me, closing the door and never going back. I asked my mother if she had any memories of any of these stories this week, because I wanted to fill in some blanks. And she said, well, you know, your sister told me many years later that when I would put her to bed for naps, she would climb out her window and sit on the roof, on the shingles, until she thought it was the end of her nap, and then she would crawl back inside. I said, wow. She said, oh, and the other thing was that the hole in the ceiling was my fault. I was crawling around in the back of the attic one day, and my foot went through the ceiling. And we were afraid to tell any of you because we thought you'd be too upset by the idea of your mother falling through the ceiling of the attic, so we didn't tell you. What she was after was a tube of architectural plans that she found at the back of the attic that established the history of the moves that I've just told you about. One night, I remember looking up at the hole in the ceiling to the attic. I tried to keep the trapdoor open for as long as I could get away with after I pushed it open because it was so difficult to manage. But I recall staring up into the void that the ladder led to and having a moment of insight into the state of the universe. I realized at that moment that time was an illusion, that we lived in an ever-present moment, and that I would never age, that my siblings would never age, that my parents would never age, that we would always be children in this house and would always be taken care of. This insight filled me with great calmness and satisfaction. It seemed self-evident, so self-evident that I didn't bother to tell anybody. But the insight never left me. Behind the house was a smaller house we called the Little House. It must have been a byproduct of the early days of the big house when it was all by itself. It was made of wood. It was plaster as well, but open wood slats and boards. Inside, various projects have been left behind by Edith Sampson, the mysterious great corrupt judge. On the second floor was a set of carrier pigeon coops that my brother Josh reminded me of. And on the first floor was a homemade ice boat. An ice boat is a Midwestern phenomenon. It's basically a plank with another plank and another plank, a couple of struts and a mast and some skates and a canvas seat. And then you sit on this thing and you go very fast on frozen rivers in the Midwest. It was either purple or brown, we can't decide on which. It was quite exciting, and we all fantasized about taking it outside and sailing it on the ice someday. But it was really too big to come out. It was sort of like Robinson Crusoe's canoe in the forest. It was just built to be in there. And like almost everything else about this house, it gradually fell apart. In fact, the greatest source of terror in my life, and the greatest indication of impermanence, was the gradual and irreversible collapse of this building. First, the windows were broken, and we said we'd fix them, and we never did. Then the floorboards began to rot and give way. The plaster began to sweat and fall away from the lathing. And each time one of these things happened, it seemed like the solution was very simple if we would just do it, but we never did it. Then the roof developed a hole, and all the water began to pour in, but the house never fell down. 20 years later, it was still there when my family finally moved out. Every time I looked at it, I had a terrible feeling of anxiety and doom, but we never were able to fix it. Another byproduct of the de-evolution of this neighborhood was at the other end of the block. It was a mansion owned by a wealthy man who collected many things. Most famously, weapons and armor from the medieval European era. He collected so much that he actually built himself a mock castle in the background. But you could walk a block from my house and go into this building with wide staircases and armored knights standing on every landing, knights on horseback. It was a fantastic place. What I remember most distinctly, though, was a medieval crossbow, which disappointed me terribly because of its incredible sophistication. Crossbows have all sorts of gears and mechanisms and winding systems. It's a great testimony to the technological skills of a 14th, 13th century gunmaker, but far less satisfying to look at than a sword or a spear or a battle axe. A year after I first saw this building, all the armor was moved out, the building was torn down, the armor went into limbo for about 30 years until it emerged in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago with its own wing, back visible to the public again, but utterly altered in its nature and impact. A student of mine in Nevada, at a college I teach at, received a grant from the state to go around visiting towns and recording their museums. She's created a website that you could visit, and she helped them write grants so they could build, oh look at drum solo. Right. Her thesis is very admirable. That the people in these small towns have lived admirable lives, and that they deserve to be seen and known. And that their little museums, which are seen only by the idle passers-by, should have a larger platform. And that is what her website does. She calls this the Modest Museum Project. In Mineral County, there's a town that's very proud of all its soldiers. And she's been very careful to sort of honor their values. So she's recorded all the names of all the people who've served and pictures of the collections of artillery shells that they have and helmets, and most beautifully this giant eagle that sort of dominates the entire room. You can sort of see behind it all these little dioramas stretching back and forth. Particularly interested in the town of Yerington, Nevada. Yerington, Nevada, like many of these small towns, is all but forgotten because during the years of railroad expansion, it was bypassed. It was bypassed by no fault of its own. It was so determined to get a railroad track through town and so terrified of not getting a track that it changed its name from Greenfield in about 1890 to Yerington, because Yerington was the name of the train magnate who ran the system in Nevada. And they thought, if we name our town after Mr. Yerington, he will be so flattered that he will naturally run a train track to our town just so people will come and see the town of Yerington. Either he wasn't susceptible to that kind of flattery, or he was too corrupt to even take the time to notice, or something in the middle, but they didn't get their town track, and they kept the name. And I don't know what Yerington thought of it to this day. Greenfield was not really the name of the town anyhow. They've been going through a lot of names. Greenfield was their first attempt to sort of upgrade the town. They must have had a very active chamber of commerce. The real name of the town, the original name of the town, was Pizzenswitch, because it was actually just a little saloon at the corner of two roads, and the saloon was so disreputable that the legend was that when they ran out of liquor, they would take the contents of the spittoons. This is the historical record, and pour it into. I don't know why that even makes sense, but the town was named Pizzenswitch, and they got a grant from the state of Nevada to make a diorama of Pizzenswitch, which is it's like according to the picture, it's a shelf with a bottle of liquor and a oil lamp. I don't know what that has to do with anything, and then another bottle of liquor, and then a sign at least as big as everything else saying, this diorama was made by Alan Watson and Jim Jones. And my student thought that was worth recording as well. The foundational myth of the town, though, is a story about a man named Harry Warren, and he has a proper diorama. Harry Warren was either the largest beekeeper in northern Nevada or an ordinary working stiff. Whatever he was around one day when they were loading 120-pound sacks of grain into the back of a cart. And in passing the time, they began to speculate about how far anybody could carry one of these sacks of grain. And Harry said, I can carry this sack to Yerington, just 10 miles away. And they said, prove it, Harry. And he said, well, make it worth my while. So they passed the hat. They actually passed the hat for several days. So they put up $1,500. And Harry put the sack on his shoulders like a cross. And he set out and he walked the 10 miles to Yerington without stopping more than once, collected the money. According to the beekeeper, this may be the confusion of whether Harry was a beekeeper or not. The beekeeper said, I've been keeping bees for 30 years, and none of them ever stung me, but Harry sure stung me. I was so taken by this idea of the innocent, the modest museum, that I looked it up and I found this manifesto for it's called a modest manifesto, but it was for innocent objects and museums, and it was written by Orhan Pamuk, a writer, and his thesis is that museums, the Louvre, the Met, Prado, are all institutions of national pride, that their big, wide doors are designed to dehumanize not just those who go in, but what's inside, to tell the story of the state and the power of the state. That the future of the museum is in these small spaces where one person puts one thing out and one person comes and sees it, and somehow in the sort of magical, vibrant being of the objects, some spark of understanding is passed from one generation or one person to another. Pamuk wrote a novel called Innocent Objects. It took him a long time to write, and as he was writing it, it was sort of an experimental novel, a kind of encyclopedic novel. He began to collect the objects that were part of the story, and he realized that the story had to have an intrusion into the real world. So we bought a building in his home neighborhood in Istanbul and began to fill it with these objects. The man in the story has a background similar to him, a sort of a privileged, middle-class man on the rise in his love affairs and various adventures he had. He said he got the story when his family was visited by an acquaintance, Prince Ali Vasib Effendi, who would have been the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire if the Ottoman Empire still existed in 1983, but it hadn't been around for 50 or 60 years. His great-grandfather had been the last Sultan. He'd spent his last 50 years in exile, living amongst other disinherited royals. Most of the time he lived in Alexandria, Egypt, where he was a ticket taker and then later the director of a palace that was also a museum. He was very proud of his job there. He was in charge of maintaining the cleanliness and management of the silverware and the glassware, the furniture, and the guests. The guests were people like himself, or would have been like himself, if he had maintained his power. The Shah of Iran, the son of the Shah of Iran, who became the last Shah, and his wife, Princess, what's her name? Fazia, who looked like Hedy Lamarr apparently, stayed with them. And her brother, King Farouk, the last king of the brief reign of British installed royalty in Egypt. King Farouk was there, and Prince Ali entertained his guests with stories of Farouk's kleptomania. Farouk became king at the age of 16 and immediately began to collect everything. He had the world's greatest collection of coins, apparently 8,500 coins. He had collected stamps. He collected cars. He apparently collected pornography. And he saw a plate in the Palace Antonides that Prince Ali was running, and he stole it for his own collection. This was a kind of story that you could dine out in Istanbul. Farouk wrote a memoir where he speculated with some glee about how he thought the usurpers would have reacted to his collections in his palace. Nasser overthrew him, but he was sure it was the Muslim Brotherhood, who we still are aware of to this day, who he thought of as prim, uptight, superstitious, and pathetic creatures. And he wrote about how they would walk through his rooms like old ladies on a cook's tour, pulling out drawers and opening cupboards and staring at all of his shirts and pants and dresses and collections of gold and just ooh and ah. And he wishes he could have been there to see it for some reason. Prince Ali was afraid of indigence. He wanted a job, but everybody knew he couldn't get a job because the Turkish secret police was afraid he was there to spark an uprising. But anybody who knew him knew that was the last thing he wanted. He just wanted a job. So they began to speculate about what kind of job Ali could have. And this was the beginning of Pamuk's interest in the small museum. So what would happen if Ali was given the chance to become a guide at the very palace that he'd lived in as a young man? And imagine taking a group of tourists through the palace and coming to a room where he could say to them, "This is the room where, as a young man, I did my mathematics with my aide-de-camp. Here's the desk that I sat at. Here's the paper that I used and the pencils and the rulers." And then he would step, this is the speculation of Pamuk, the future novelist, step over the velvet rope and then sit down at the desk and perform the same operation that he'd done as a young boy for the tourists. Simultaneously being both a guide to the history of this place and a relic itself. He felt this was a grand and exquisite fate for anyone. He got a Nobel Prize, so I guess who are we to argue about that? I can't hear stories like that without hearing a story I think I've told you before that seems closer to reality to me, which is Nabokov's recollection of a kind of a similar experience. His family, too, was exiled after a revolution. He came from an incredibly distinguished family of government servants, businessmen, intellectuals. They had to flee after the revolution. And he lived most of his childhood in Europe before settling in the United States. And he said he always remembered and carried with him the image of the bedroom that he slept in as a young boy, where the bed was, where the tables were, where the window was, bureaus, bookshelves. Every time I hear that story, I think of my own bedroom for some reason in the window out over the roof. He never spoke of this room or this memory to anyone until much later in his life when he was writing a novel which required him to describe the bedroom of a character for some particular reason. And so, like many writers, actors, artists, he drew on his memory and he regurgitated this room, where the bed was, where the window was, where the shelf was. He felt after he'd done that like he'd lost a part of himself, that this memory, which was so central to his sense of who he'd been as a boy and where he'd come from, by sharing it, by turning it into the sort of image in a book about somebody else that someone else would read, had utterly changed its relationship to him, and that his own memory of his past was compromised by the work he did as a writer, which he chalked up to being the cost of being an artist, that you would consume and alter your own life for the service of another point, but you would not personally benefit from that experience. The house that I now live in is an old synagogue, and every Jewish holiday, a little rabbi who believes that the building belongs to him rings a doorbell and brings us a gift which is appropriate to the holiday. If it's Passover, which involves the escape from Egypt, and unleavened bread, he brings us unleavened bread. If it's Hanukkah with the menorah and the candles, he brings menorah and candles. He brings sweets when there should be sweets. Every week he leaves us a circular that is written from beyond the grave by his Messiah, Rabbi Sarachev. I'm sorry, he's Rabbi Sarachev. It's Rabbi Schneerson is the Messiah. And he's waiting for God to give him back the building. We just recently went through the Jewish New Year. Tradition is to blow the shofar, ram's horn, to ensure good luck. And the doorbell rang one day, and I went out to open the door, and there he is with the ram's horn, and he begins blowing this. It's a very hard thing to do, to blow a ram's horn. It's basically a tube made out of fingernails that twists, and you have to blow, and this god-awful sound comes out. I'm standing there waiting for him to finish, and then suddenly the doors swing up behind me, and it's Jude and all our dogs, and they see him, and they rush back in, and then I go back and I say, "What happened?" She said, "We thought you'd been stabbed, and we were coming to see if we could do anything, but there's no way I'm staying in the same room as that man." After we left the big house, my mother moved into an apartment building with lots of other people from the university, and her life became complicated in a different way, all the different agendas. One of her neighbors is a woman, Madame M, and her husband, who live on the top floor. They lived through the occupation of Paris by the Germans. And their great passion in life is feeding the squirrels in the yard, which they do obsessively, much to the consternation of everybody else in the building, especially Frau H, who lives with her husband on the first floor. And they are constantly at war over the squirrels. Specifically about a tree limb that stretches from the trunk to the window where Madame M lives, and she puts food out for the squirrels, peanuts, and they run across the limb and eat them, and then they poop all over Frau H's geraniums. The problem came to a head literally once when a squirrel fell from the limb on top of hair ate his head and scratched him. At this point, they called the tree service to come and saw down the limb. They arrived with their equipment, only to be greeted by Madame M. with her broom, standing between them, swinging in a wide arc, trying to keep anyone away from the tree. They assessed the situation to the best of their ability, basically, apparently, trying to determine who was crazier, the old German lady or the old French lady. They decided it was the old French lady, so they climbed up the tree and sawed down the branch, breaking Madame M's heart, but not her spirit. What she told my mother was one of the few people in the condominium who can talk to her. She said, "That woman is a Nazi. I lived through the Nazis, and I know what a Nazi looks like." Last week I was in Philadelphia, and a man in a red hat handed me a piece of paper. It was a large broadsheet newspaper. It said it was called the Hamiltonian. And there was a picture of Lyndon LaRouche on one side, and then all the bankers of the major economic powers on the other. And the headline was that we were on the verge of global collapse. On the back was a picture of Obama. It said, "World headed for nuclear war. Obama will start World War III to cover up his economic incompetence. He must be impeached immediately." This brought back a lot of memories. Lyndon LaRouche was an old Marxist who began a kind of cult in the 60s that was extremely left-wing until it wasn't, and it became extremely right-wing. But at one point, they became interested in my father because he had served on some board, probably just as an advisor, to some organization, did something that they suspected of doing something nefarious. So he was at an economic just an academic conference in Hawaii. He came back very happy with a story that had unfolded at a very dry panel at the end of some presentation, when a man from the Labor Party, the LaRouche cover organization, stood up and began to read an indictment against my father for crimes against humanity, which aroused the anger of the other academics, which the man from the Labor Party very coolly said, "I don't know why you're all being upset. Nobody's threatening Dr. Freedman. He's only been indicted. He has a right to a fair trial. Only if he's proven guilty will he be punished." My father loved to tell the story because he liked the sort of insanity of it all, but I think also because he enjoyed the suggestion that instead of just being a college professor, he was in fact helping to run the world behind the scenes. And he was very happy. We were all very impressed that the university police kept a car outside the house for a few weeks to see if anybody would do anything. And the gym teacher said he drove his car by back and forth to protect us. And nothing ever came of it. Drum solo. Despite the problems with the LaRouches, my father actually loved having people from these sorts of organizations from various levels on the spectrum come by, as they did in our neighborhood all the time. asking for donations or purchases of newspapers, and he would always invite them in. People from the Peace Stone Nation, the Black Muslim headquarters were down the street, so they were often there, the Panthers, and they would come through, and instead of getting money from the old man, he would invite them in, and they would have to drink tea and eat cookies and sit and debate him for hours on end while his children sat around listening in order to be edified by the sort of the potential of human dialogue and mutual understanding, which never quite panned out. One of the more active organizations at that point were the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I was very happy. The same day that the man from the LaRouche organization gave me the sheet, I got a book on 10 choices in life from the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses were started about 130 years ago by Charles Taze Russell, a kind of Brigham Young look-alike type who passed on the organization's administrative and theocratic reins to a man named Joseph Rutherford, who was actually a lawyer. But when he took over, he sort of threw himself into all aspects of the organization, creating great schisms that have sort of split it into many different parts to this day. But he's responsible for many of the tenets that we associate with the Jehovah's Witnesses to this day. He predicted that Jehovah God would return in 1914, which didn't happen. But he eliminated the worship of anything he felt was idolatrous. Birthdays, Christmas, almost any holiday was taken off the books. He lived in San Diego for his health. He apparently had a bit of a drinking problem. There's a lady from the Jehovah's Witnesses who comes by our synagogue, I remember. And she would try to begin to engage me in a dialogue which would lead to a greater communion by commenting on our dogs. She said, I didn't know Jews had dogs, which as a conversation opener, I found kind of insulting in a way, because I didn't think that I was a generic Jew with dogs. And it was interesting because she was going to try to talk to me about her religion, and I think she saw this as a way of discussing our mutual faith systems that would lead to a discussion of her superior faith system. But I never fully engaged her with this, but she kept coming back and trying to be polite, and I was never polite. In fact, we had these sort of fantasies that we would invite her in, but instead of having an honest dialogue like my father would have, we would create this sort of sinful scene that she would have to wade through and try to ignore, and then be sent on her way. But finally, she seemed to get the message, unlike the little rabbi, and stopped coming by. Jews really have no problem with dogs unless they're Orthodox. When we lived on Metropolitan in Williamsburg, we lived across the street from a slaughterhouse, a chicken slaughterhouse. I remember once we were walking our Williamsburg dogs by there, and a little yeshiva school was letting out. They just had a tour of the slaughterhouse, and these little boys were so excited by the experience of seeing chicken slaughtered up close that they couldn't contain themselves, and they ran up to the dogs, which apparently they hadn't seen much of, and they climbed on as though they were horses and tried to ride them around the slaughterhouse. And we kept pulling the dogs away, and they kept climbing on. And then their teachers came out and were just as excited by what they saw, and they reached into the dumpsters outside the slaughterhouse and they pulled out handfuls of chicken guts, intestines, stomachs, hearts, lungs, gizzards, and they tried to force them on the dogs to feed them as an act of friendship, which the dogs utterly rejected. One of the other innovations that Joseph Rutherford imparted to the followers was the theory that Jesus Christ was not crucified on the cross, but on a tree. And as soon as I saw that, I was lost because this seemed wonderful. So I looked up. Apparently this is a subject of great speculation. What exactly was Jesus crucified on, really? Was it a cross? Was it a stake? Was it a tree? It's the nature of Christ's suffering, the passion of Christ, which is of great significance all throughout the history of the church, particularly in the Renaissance and medieval era and contemporarily. What did he go through? What did he feel? The intensity of the physical experience of his torture was a measure of the sacrifice of his Father sending his only begotten Son down to earth to die for our sins. That they counted his wounds, 5,466. That there's if you say Our Father 15 times a day, you'll say enough to cover all of the wounds in a single year. This was the invention of St. Gertrude. In the 20th century, this fascination took on a kind of scientific aspect. A ex-World War I surgeon named Barbet, a French surgeon, wrote a learned book in the 1960s about how it was that the crucifixion could have taken place. He got a hold of a severed arm, an amputated arm, to which he tied an 88-pound weight. And then he drove a nail through the palm and reported that it didn't hold. 88 pounds is about half of a human body, he theorized. So if the hand couldn't hold up that much, it couldn't support the weight of a body. And therefore, either the nail had to go through the wrists and or the feet could no longer dangle free. It had to be supported from below, which would decrease the level of pressure, the weight on the arms. But then he further speculated that based on observations of contemporary executions, the problem would be that after a few minutes, the stress of the position would cause Christ to begin to sink, and he would sink down, and then his diaphragm would jam up against his rib cage, and he couldn't take a breath, so he'd have to push himself up, and then he would sink down and push himself up. So in fact, that Jesus Christ on the cross is a kind of animated image of a man sort of doing push-ups like this until he could no longer sustain the position and he would be asphyxiated. And this became the sort of accepted scientific explanation of the experience on the cross. But they weren't done. There's an amazing photograph of a kind of Christ-like corpse, a skinny man nailed by one hand to a board that another French doctor took to show that in fact you could get a nail through a hand and hold up a whole body. But then a contemporary medical examiner from Rockland County, Dr. Zujubi, a feisty and argumentative man, wrote his own book about 20 years ago, where he sort of rejected all the other theories about what Christ went through on the cross, because, as he said, he's like to throw around stories. There's a story about Apelles, the Alexander the Great's painter, who had painted a figure with a sandal on, and a sandal maker had walked by and said, the latch on the sandal is badly painted. It needs to be corrected. So he was hiding behind the painting. He comes out and he corrects it. And the sandal maker is so encouraged by being taken seriously that he says, well, and the leg doesn't look very good either. At which point the painter said something to the effect, I might quote the Latin, supra ne ultra crepidam, which is shoemaker not above the shoe, meaning don't talk about things you don't know. And an ultra-crepidarian is someone who talks about things they don't know, which is a word that I need to know very well, I think. But in any case, the GB said that all these people who have been nailing corpses with to prove that could or could not be supported by weight were using bad bodies, and that in fact you could support the weight. He didn't have the option anymore, unfortunately. I think he felt, to nail people up, but he had a lot of volunteers from the local church, and he devised this sort of ingenious system of gloves and seat belts to sort of tie people up to the cross and run a bunch of electrodes off of them into a machine. And there's a great picture of him. It looks like he's in his office with like lace curtains behind him, and a man who looks like he belongs in a discotheque, kind of chubby, with one of those 1970s mustaches and trunks, and he's sort of leaning over him, and he's all wired up, and Dr. Zajibi is in his white coat, lab coat, and he's looking at some dials and testing. I've gone through so many things, Tim. You could do another solo. I hope this is not the last one. What Zajibi suggested is that it actually we're almost through the inventory. I won't even bother to draw this one. You could speak, you could breathe up there, but it was a highly stressed situation. And that what actually happened is, first your blood pressure would drop to about 80/50, then your heart rate would go up to about 250, and your legs, which were supporting the weight at this highly stressed angle, would give way, and you would actually have a kind of aneurysm. Your heart would literally burst. That was his conclusion, which actually is sort of in keeping with the position of St. Gertrude in the cult of the Sacred Heart, which is exemplified by the cross, the flame, the sword in the side, and then the crown of thorns around it, and the representation of this bursting heart in the chest of Jesus. This is all collectively known as the ostentatio. All right. You're not going to get out of here that easily. The display of the wounds. I'm not the only Jewish guy who's fascinated by this. Leo Steinberg, a refugee himself of sorts from the Russian Revolution. His father was actually a commissar who fell into early disfavor from Stalin, and they had to get out of there. He ended up in England studying art, and then came to the United States, became an art critic, successful enough that in the painted word, Tom identified him as part of Cultureberg with Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg as the people who were part of this sort of corrupt pyramid of art theory, commerce, and practice, where they moved us from a kind of a history of representation to abstraction and flatness, and then pure theoretical abstract thought as art disappeared up its own fundament. But Steinberg got off that train early on and became a historian. And one of his great and controversial contributions was a book about the sexuality of Jesus Christ and his descent into oblivion, which he coined ostentatium genitalium, not the display of the wound, but the display of the godly junk. The idea is that if you look at art, representations of Christ after about 1400, or maybe a little bit before, you see an amazingly obvious representation of the genitals of the baby Jesus, not just being displayed, but being touched, sometimes by the baby Jesus himself, sometimes by his mother, sometimes by his grandmother, sometimes by God. And then it's never spoken of again. His theory is that it's the sexuality of Jesus was as important in the sort of theoretical development of the nature of the sacrifice of God for mankind as his suffering was, and that only by representing him as a fully formed and sexual being could we understand the nature of his commitment to humanity. And in fact, it goes beyond that. There's, in many of the pictures of Jesus with his mother, he's reaching up and giving her a little chuck on the chin, a chin chuck. Now, his critics say this is just part, as are the representations of the naked Jesus, of sort of Renaissance naturalism. But this happens over and over again, and Steinberg says this is a highly eroticized gesture of the husband and to a wife, and that the baby Jesus hitting his mother under the chin prefigures his role as her heavenly husband in the world to come. It's not just the baby Jesus' genitals that Steinberg was interested in. It's Jesus on the cross, or off the descent of the cross, is represented with an enormous erection, always under wraps, but occasionally impossible to ignore. Again, the argument is that he's studied, the painters of the time studied the records of executions and said this is what happens to executed men, which there is some anecdotal evidence of. But Steinberg, again, takes the position that this is another reflection of the passion of Christ in another sense, and that only by representing him as a fully formed sexual being capable of arousal would his chastity have any weight. And that, I'm sure he was very proud of this pun, that the resurrection of Christ was in fact inextricably linked to his sexuality. it's a good story, at least. When I was living in Chicago by myself, at some point, we had a whole network of other religious visitors. One day, in the doorway were two young Mormon missionaries, complete with the black pants, the white shirt, the backpacks. And they began to talk to me as best they could, and I began to try to shut the door as best I could on them. Not that I had any particular reason to worry about them. I felt intruded on by their persistence and good cheer, and I felt like I wanted to hurt their feelings somehow. And I didn't really care that they were talking to me, but I somehow felt like I wanted them to feel bad about talking to me. So I pulled the old, don't you respect other religious traditions, and can't you not feel how insulting it is to come up to somebody of another faith and tell them, and the whole story. And they listened to that, and they started again, and I started again, and I said, well, I'm sorry, I have to go. And I began to close the door on them, and then one of them literally stuck his shoe in the crack and said, wait. And I opened the door a little bit, and he said, I just have one question for you. I said, yes, what is that? And he said, what if you're wrong? And I closed the door, and I thought, shit, that's too good a stupid question. I'm never going to forget it. And it's not even profound. It's just one of those, like, earworms that you put in somebody's head. Like, am I supposed to now be thinking for the rest of my life that maybe Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the answer and that I'm wrong, and that sooner or later, maybe 40, 50 years later, I'll have an epiphany and come to the truth? Or am I just going to spend the rest of my life being irritated that he got the last laugh on me with this stupid little logical twist that's not any more profound than saying the statement on the other side of this paper is incorrect and writing it on both sides of the paper? I don't know. It's stuck in my head forever now, and I will never see that guy again, and I'll never be able to ask him a similarly impossible question. The only truly miraculous event I ever took part in happened in the basement of that building a short time later. It was owned by a friend of mine. Don't worry, we're almost done. And they were fixing up the basement for another artist to live in. And he hired a bunch of neighborhood guys to come and clear out the space, and then began to frame in the basement with wood so they could drop the ceiling, bring out the walls, create hallways and rooms. And I remember after a few days they'd done all the framing and they were quitting for the day, and they invited me to come down and spend a couple of hours drinking beer with them. Remember, it was close. It had the same sort of wood smell of any room that's full of sawdust and nails. And, I hadn't a lot of experience drinking beer, but I was determined not to embarrass myself. And I thought, I'd come down, drink a beer, go back. There's a bunch of men sitting there, and they're drinking beer, and they hand me a beer, and I drink the beer. And then they drink another beer, and they hand me a beer, and I drink a second beer. Now I'm frankly getting into unknown territory. And the third beer, and a fourth beer, I'm discovering that it's actually fairly easy to drink beer, but after 5 beers, I realized there were consequences to this. It was about this time that they began playing a game. There was a wheelbarrow in the middle of the room, and after every beer, they would throw their can at the wheelbarrow. Sometimes it would fall in, sometimes it would bounce out, sometimes it would miss altogether. I was just trying to be as inobtrusive as possible and drink my beer and just wait for this hell to end. But then they noticed me and they began to encourage me to throw my beer cans in the wheelbarrow. I was now up to the 6th beer, and I could barely focus or even move my arms. And I knew that whatever I did would be a horrible embarrassment to myself and my family. But I couldn't say no. I was unable to say no at this point because I was unable to speak, really. So after listening to their chanting for a while, I took the can and tried to throw it towards the wheelbarrow. But I couldn't even grip the can, and instead of going towards the wheelbarrow, it went straight up in the air because I couldn't even, it went up in the air, and then it somehow changed direction like a magic bullet and began to fly through the joists that were hanging down without touching one of them. I was threading a needle like Luke Skywalker and attacking the Death Star. It kept flying on and on and on through all these joists, and then it began to fall, and it fell straight into the wheelbarrow. And we all stared at it, and I heaved myself to my feet, and I said, "Gentlemen, I bid you adieu." And that's all I remember. Thank you.